August 18, 1944. Wing Commander Desmond Scott pushes his Hawker Typhoon into a screaming 60-degree dive. Below him, a German convoy stretches for miles. Trucks, tanks, horse-drawn wagons. Thousands of men trapped on narrow Norman roads with nowhere to run. His finger squeezes the trigger. 8 rockets scream from beneath his wings. Each one carries 60 pounds of high-explosive death. They slam into the convoy at nearly 1,000 miles per hour. A fuel truck explodes into a fireball that engulfs everything within 50 meters. Men burn alive. Horses collapse in their traces. Ammunition trucks detonate in chain reactions that hurl debris hundreds of yards in every direction. Before the smoke clears, Scott opens up with his 4 20mm cannons. 3 200 rounds per minute tear through metal, wood, and flesh. He watches a truck literally disintegrate under the hammering. In 10 days, aircraft just like his will help destroy an entire German army. 10,000 dead, 50,000 captured, 350 tanks turned into burning scrap metal. But here is what makes this story insane. The Typhoon was never supposed to be a ground attack aircraft. It was designed as a high-altitude interceptor. And for the first 2 years of its existence, it was considered the most dangerous aircraft in the Royal Air Force. Not dangerous to the enemy, dangerous to its own pilots. This is the story of how a failed fighter, an aircraft that killed more British pilots in accidents than in combat, became the most feared ground attack weapon of World War II. And how it helped end the war in Europe. Let me take you back to the beginning. February 1940. Europe is on the edge of catastrophe. Hitler's armies have conquered Poland. France is about to fall. Britain stands alone against the Nazi war machine. And the Royal Air Force has a problem that keeps its commanders awake at night. The Hurricane, the fighter that will help win the Battle of Britain, is already becoming obsolete. German aircraft technology is advancing rapidly. British intelligence reports suggest the Luftwaffe is developing new fighters that will outclass everything the RAF has in service. The Air Ministry needs a solution. They need a new fighter that can climb higher, fly faster, and hit harder than anything the Germans can produce. They turn to one of Britain's legendary aircraft designers, Sidney Cam, of Hawker Aircraft. Cam is a genius. He designed the Hurricane. He understands what modern air combat demands, and he has an idea that is revolutionary for its time. He wants to build a monster. The aircraft he proposes will be unlike anything that has ever flown. Its heart will be the new Napier Sabre engine, a 24-cylinder beast producing over 2,000 horsepower. That is nearly twice the power of contemporary fighters. Its wings will house 4 20mm cannons firepower that can shred a bomber in seconds. At over 11,000 pounds loaded, it will weigh nearly twice as much as early Spitfires. The Air Ministry approves the design. They call it the Typhoon. It is supposed to be the ultimate interceptor. The aircraft that will sweep German bombers from British skies. That was the theory. The reality was a nightmare. May 9, 1940. Test pilot Philip Lucas is flying the first Typhoon prototype over Langley Airfield. Everything seems normal. The massive Sabre engine roars with power. The aircraft handles well. Lucas begins a routine maneuver. Then he feels it. A shuddering vibration runs through the airframe. Something is terribly wrong. Lucas looks back toward the tail. What he sees makes his blood run cold. The rear fuselage is separating from the forward section. He can see daylight through the crack. The aircraft is literally breaking apart around him. Any sane pilot would bail out. Lucas does not. He nurses the dying aircraft back to Langley, fighting the controls every second. Somehow, he lands the disintegrating Typhoon in one piece. For saving the prototype, Lucas receives the George Medal. But for the Typhoon program, his heroic landing is just the beginning of 2 years of disaster. The problems cascade in terrifying succession. Carbon monoxide from the engine seeps into the cockpit through faulty seals. Pilots fly wearing oxygen masks even at low altitude. Some pass out anyway from the fumes. At least 3 pilots die from carbon monoxide poisoning before anyone realizes what is happening. The Napier Sabre engine, that magnificent power plant that was supposed to give the Typhoon its edge, turns out to be a maintenance nightmare. Its complex sleeve valve design requires over 1,000 fine adjustments every 40 hours of flight. In cold weather, it refuses to start. When it does start, it frequently catches fire on the ground. In flight, it consumes oil at an alarming rate and often fails without warning. The thick wings that house those powerful cannons create aerodynamic problems at high altitude. Above 20,000 feet, exactly where the Typhoon is supposed to intercept bombers, it becomes dangerously unstable. Pilots describe it as rattling so violently the tail feels ready to fall off. And then the tail starts falling off. Between September 1941 and August 1942, Typhoons begin disintegrating in flight. The joint between the forward and rear fuselage fails catastrophically, usually during high-speed flight or violent maneuvers. August 1942. Hawker's test pilot, Ken Seth Smith, takes a Typhoon up for a routine speed test over the town of Thorpe. The aircraft breaks apart at altitude. Seth Smith is killed instantly. In total, 25 aircraft are lost to tail failures. 23 pilots die. Young men in their early 20s, full of promise, killed by the very aircraft they trusted to protect them. The cause is eventually traced to elevator flutter and structural fatigue. But the fix is only partially successful. Typhoons continue losing their tails throughout their service life. The cockpit is another disaster. Early models have a forward-opening car door with windowed windows and a solid metal fairing behind the pilot. You cannot see behind you. In air combat, this is a death sentence. Typhoons are frequently shot down by German fighters they never saw coming. Even worse, Typhoons are being shot down by their own side. From certain angles, the Typhoon looks disturbingly similar to the German Focke-Wulf 190. British anti-aircraft gunners and other Allied fighters regularly engage Typhoons, thinking they are German. The solution comes in late 1942. They paint black and white stripes on the wing undersides. But not before friendly fire claims several aircraft. By early 1942, discussions at Air Ministry headquarters turned serious. The Typhoon is killing more pilots in accidents than in combat. Production should be halted. Resources should go to proven designs like the Spitfire. The Typhoon is about to be cancelled, and then something happens that changes everything. The Focke-Wulf 190 raids intensify. German fighter bombers are hitting targets along the English coast with impunity. They come in fast and low, drop their bombs, and escape before anyone can respond. Spitfires, magnificent at altitude, simply cannot catch them at sea level. But someone notices something interesting about the Typhoon. Below 10,000 feet, where its problematic thick wings do not matter, the Typhoon is fast, very fast. With that massive Sabre engine delivering full power, nothing can outrun it in the weeds. Squadron leader Roland Beaumont of 609 Squadron sees what others miss. Beaumont had worked as a Hawker test pilot before the war. He knows the Typhoon's capabilities better than almost anyone. And he realizes something that will change the course of aviation history. The Typhoon is not a failed interceptor. It is something else entirely. In September 1942, 609 Squadron is based at Manston Airfield in Kent. They begin flying standing patrols at low altitude, waiting for the Focke-Wulf tip, and run raids. When the Germans come, the Typhoons are ready. Within a week, they shoot down 4 FW-190s. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's raiders face an opponent that can match their speed and outgun them. The successes keep coming. The Typhoon has found its calling. But this is just the beginning. In January 1943, a conference is called to determine the aircraft's fate. The decision is radical. They will stop trying to make the Typhoon into a high-altitude interceptor. Instead, they will develop it as a low-level strike fighter. Remove the altitude gear. Add armor underneath. and most significantly, give it the ability to carry bombs and rockets. The Typhoon will become a fighter bomber. Nobody yet realizes they are creating the most devastating ground attack weapon of the war. The transformation begins immediately. Typhoons are fitted with bomb racks capable of carrying 2 500-pound bombs, or even 1,000-pounders. The press nicknames them bombfoons. In early 1943, they begin striking targets in occupied France. Railroad yards, bridges, coastal installations. But the real revolution comes in June 1943. Hawker engineers fit a Typhoon with 8 rocket rails, 4 under each wing. The rocket is designated RP-3, named for its 3-inch motor diameter. Each rocket is 55 inches long and weighs 60 pounds with its standard warhead. This is essentially an unguided missile. A steel tube filled with 11.5 pounds of cordite propellant fitted with a 60-pound semi-armor piercing high-explosive warhead at the front and 4 large aluminum fins at the rear. The accuracy is terrible. Out of every 100 rockets fired, only about 4 will hit their intended targets directly. But here is what the critics miss. The rockets do not need direct hits to be effective. A 60-pound warhead exploding 10 yards from a truck is still lethal. The blast radius, the shrapnel, the secondary explosions from ammunition and fuel create devastation far beyond the point of impact. October 1943. Number 181 Squadron makes the first operational rocket attacks near Kong. The mission is not a success. 3 Typhoons are lost, and the rockets prove wildly inaccurate. Pilots fire from too high from too far with improper dive angles. The learning curve is steep and bloody. But they learn. By early 1944, Typhoon pilots have developed the tactics that will make them legendary. The attack profile is specific and terrifying. Approach the target area at 8,000 feet or higher. Spot the target. Roll inverted, and pull into a 60-degree dive. The Typhoon's weight, once a liability, now becomes an asset. In a dive, it accelerates like a meteor, reaching speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. At 4,000 feet, with the target filling the gunsight fire, the rockets in salvo. 8 rockets launching simultaneously, screaming toward the target at nearly 1,000 miles per hour. Then, even as the rockets are still in flight, open fire with the 4 20mm cannons. Each cannon fires at 800 rounds per minute, a combined rate of over 3,000 rounds per minute. At close range, this concentrated firepower can saw a vehicle in half in seconds. Pull out of the dive at 1,000 feet or lower. Feel the G-forces compress your body as the Typhoon's massive wings bite into the air. Climb away with German flak bursting around you. If you survive, circle around and do it again. The psychological effect on German troops is devastating. The Napier Sabre engine produces a distinctive sound. The 4-bladed propeller, introduced in early 1944, has broad paddle-shaped blades 13 feet in diameter. At high power settings, the blade tips reach supersonic speeds, creating a thundering roar that can be heard from miles away. German soldiers call it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. When you hear that sound, you have seconds to find cover. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, 26 Typhoon squadrons are operational. They have been preparing for months, striking targets across France, radar stations, gun emplacements, bridges, supply dumps. On June 6 itself, over 500 Typhoons provide air cover for the invasion. They create an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. Luftwaffe fighters that attempt to reach the landing zones are massacred. The Typhoon has proven itself. The failed interceptor has become an instrument of destruction, unlike anything the war has seen. But its greatest test is yet to come. In August 1944, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army will find themselves trapped in a pocket near the town of Falaise. 150,000 men, thousands of vehicles, trying to escape through a corridor barely 2 miles wide, and waiting for them in the skies above will be the Typhoons. What happens next will be described as one of the greatest killing fields of the entire war, a slaughter so complete that it will shock even the men who witness it. In Part 2, we will see how the Typhoon helped destroy an entire German army in 10 days of unrelenting carnage. We will walk through the narrow lanes choked with burning vehicles and dead men. We will hear the testimony of survivors on both sides. And we will understand why decades later, the pilots who flew those missions still could not speak of what they had done. The thunder was about to speak, and an army was about to die. In Part 1, we witnessed the birth of a legend. An aircraft that was supposed to be canceled. An aircraft that killed more of its own pilots than the enemy. The Hawker Typhoon transformed from a failed interceptor into the most devastating ground attack weapon of World War II. By D-Day, 26 squadrons were ready. 500 Typhoons created an impenetrable umbrella over the Normandy beaches. The thunder had found its voice. But everything we have seen so far was just a prelude. Because in August 1944, the Typhoon would face its ultimate test, a killing ground that would shock even the men who created it. In 10 days, they would help destroy an entire German army. 10,000 dead, 50,000 captured, 350 tanks reduced to burning scrap metal. And this is where our story becomes something different, something darker. Something that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Let me show you what happens when thunder meets trapped men with nowhere to run. 2.5 months after D-Day, the Allied breakout from Normandy had stalled into attritional warfare. The bocage country of northern France was a defender's paradise. High hedgerows lined every field. Narrow, sunken lanes created natural fortifications. Each field became a small fortress. German forces, despite horrific losses, held on with characteristic tenacity. The Allies measured progress in hundreds of yards. Casualties mounted. The war that was supposed to end quickly was turning into a bloodbath. General Bernard Montgomery commanded British and Canadian forces in the north. General Omar Bradley commanded the Americans in the south. Between them, they had over 1 million men and thousands of tanks. Yet they could not break through. The Wehrmacht's defensive skills were legendary. Even depleted units missing half their men could hold positions against forces 3 times their size. The hedgerows negated Allied advantages in armor and artillery. Every attack became a costly frontal assault. And then Adolf Hitler made a decision that would destroy his army in the West. In early August, everything changed. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from St. Lo, succeeded beyond all expectations. General George Patton's Third Army poured through the gap, racing south and then east. The German lines were finally cracking. A competent commander would have ordered a strategic withdrawal. Pull back to the Seine River. Establish new defensive positions. Preserve the army to fight another day. Hitler was not a competent commander. Instead of retreating, he ordered a counterattack. Operation Lüttich would strike west toward Avranches, cutting off Patton's army from its supply lines. It was military fantasy. The Germans no longer had the strength for offensive operations. Their fuel was running low. Their air cover was virtually non-existent. But Hitler insisted, and German commanders obeyed. On August 7th, German armor moved toward Mortain. 4 panzer divisions, the best remaining units in the West, pushed toward the American lines. They never had a chance. Ultra-intercepts had warned the Allies of the attack. American forces held key positions. More critically, the weather cleared. For the first time in days, Allied aircraft could fly. The Typhoons descended on the German columns with overwhelming force. Flight Lieutenant John Goley of 181 Squadron was one of the first pilots over Mortain that morning. What he saw became seared into his memory. German tanks and vehicles packed bumper to bumper on narrow roads. They had moved at night thinking darkness would protect them. Now they were caught in daylight with nowhere to hide. Goley pushed his Typhoon into a 60-degree dive. 8 rockets screamed from beneath his wings. He watched them slam into a cluster of Panther tanks. One exploded immediately, its ammunition cooking off in a chain of secondary explosions. A second burst into flames. Behind him, more Typhoons were already diving. Wave after wave. The attack was relentless. The German counteroffensive collapsed within 48 hours. But in collapsing, it created something far more dangerous. A trap. Field Marshal Montgomery saw the opportunity immediately. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army had pushed west deep into a salient. Allied forces were positioned to the north and south. If they could close the gap, they could trap the entire German army group. It would be the largest encirclement on the Western Front. Canadian and British forces would push south from Caen toward the town of Falaise. American forces would drive north from Argenton. Between them, they would close the jaws on 150,000 German soldiers. On August 7th, Canadian forces launched Operation Totalize, a night attack using innovative tactics. Bomber Command had dropped thousands of bombs to clear a path. Tanks advanced in darkness, navigating by compass and the stars. The Germans fought with desperate determination. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, composed largely of teenagers, defended every inch of ground. Many were only 17 years old. They had been indoctrinated since childhood. They knew nothing except war, and they would rather die than surrender. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards. Days passed. The gap remained open. But by August 16th, the situation had become catastrophic for the Germans. Hitler finally authorized withdrawal, but it was far too late. The only escape route was a narrow corridor between Falaise and Argenton, a gap barely 2 miles wide. Through this tiny opening, what remained of 7 German divisions had to escape. 150,000 men, thousands of vehicles, horse-drawn wagons, artillery, armor, supply trucks, medical units, headquarters staff, all trying to squeeze through a 2-mile gap before the trap closed completely. The roads became parking lots. Vehicles jammed bumper to bumper in the darkness, drivers cursing, officers shouting orders that no one could follow, horses panicking, men abandoning vehicles and trying to walk. Complete chaos. And then dawn broke on August 18, 1944. Wing Commander Desmond Scott of 123 Wing received his orders that morning. Armed reconnaissance over the Falaise Pocket. Find targets of opportunity. Destroy everything that moves. Scott climbed into his Typhoon at first light. Within 30 minutes, he was over the pocket at 8,000 feet. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The narrow lanes below were solid with transport. Not scattered vehicles, not columns. A continuous mass of metal and flesh stretching for miles in every direction. Trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, tanks, all jammed together with absolutely nowhere to go. Scott called in his squadrons. The Typhoons arrived in waves. Flights of 4 aircraft at a time. They circled above the pocket like sharks around a wounded whale. Then one by one they rolled inverted and dove into the killing ground. The attack was methodical, systematic, industrial. Roll in from 8,000 feet. Pick a section of road packed with vehicles. Push into a 60-degree dive. Feel the Typhoon accelerate like a falling meteor. Watch the ground rush up with terrifying speed. At 4,000 feet, fire rockets. 8 projectiles screaming toward the target. Each one carrying 60 pounds of high-explosive death. Watch the rockets impact. See the explosions walk across the convoy. A fuel truck becomes a fireball. An ammunition wagon detonates with a blast that hurls debris 200 yards. A staff car simply disintegrates. Open fire with the cannons. 200 rounds per minute, tearing into everything that survived the rockets. Watch trucks shatter under the hammering. Watch men running. Watch them fall. Pull out at 1,000 feet. Feel the G-forces crush you into the seat. Climb back to altitude. Do it again. And again. And again. The destruction was beyond anything anyone had imagined. One German survivor, Lieutenant Hans Schmidt of the 2nd Panzer Division, was captured in September 1944. His interrogation report recovered by Allied forces after the war described the attacks in horrifying detail. "We heard them before we saw them. That engine sound, like continuous thunder rolling across the sky. We knew what was coming. We had heard that sound before. But there was nowhere to hide. The roads were blocked, vehicles everywhere. We could not move forward. We could not go back. The first rockets hit the column about 200 meters ahead of us. A fuel truck exploded. The fireball engulfed everything around it. Men were burning, running and burning. Some threw themselves into ditches. The fire followed them. Then the cannon fire started. You could see the shells walking up the road, each one kicking up dust and debris. They came so fast. A continuous stream of death. A truck in front of us literally flew apart. The driver was cut in half. I dove into a drainage ditch. The aircraft passed directly overhead, so low I could see the pilot's face. He was young, maybe 20 years old. He looked calm, like he was performing a routine task. Before he was gone, another aircraft was already diving. And another, and another. The attacks continued without pause. Wave after wave, hour after hour. By afternoon, Lieutenant Schmidt's regiment had ceased to exist. The Typhoon pilots developed their own routines for the slaughter. They would take off from forward airfields in Normandy, fly the short distance to the Pocket, expend their rockets and ammunition, return to base, rearm, refuel, and take off again. Some pilots flew 5 or 6 missions per day. Flight Lieutenant Ian Waddy of 193 Squadron described one mission that has become infamous in Typhoon history. We found a convoy trapped at a crossroads. Vehicles packed so tight you could have walked across their roofs. There must have been 1,000 men down there, maybe more. They were milling around trying to find cover. There was no cover. We let our rockets go first. 8 rockets each, 4 aircraft. 32 rockets slamming into that crossroads. The explosions overlapped. Vehicles were thrown into the air. A tank flipped completely over. Then we came back with the cannons. We started at one end of the convoy and walked our fire through to the other end. It took maybe 15 seconds. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing moving. We climbed back to altitude and waited for the next flight to make their run. Then we went down again. And again. After 3 passes, I ran out of ammunition. I flew back to base. The ground crew rearmed my aircraft in 20 minutes. I was back over the Pocket 40 minutes after leaving. The convoy was still there. Most of it was burning, but there were still vehicles trying to move. Still men running. We attacked again. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers who survived described a specific sound that preceded every attack. Not the thunder of the engines, something worse. The rockets made a shrieking howl as they descended. A rising scream that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. 2 seconds to find cover. 2 seconds to pray. Most men just froze. They could track the rockets with their eyes. Watch them fall. See death coming. And they could do nothing except wait. Many German units simply broke. Discipline collapsed. Officers lost control of their men. Soldiers abandoned their vehicles and equipment, fleeing on foot toward the Seine River. They threw away their weapons, their packs, their identities. They just ran. Not all the destruction came from the air. On August 19th, Polish forces of the 1st Armored Division seized Hill 262, overlooking the last escape route near Chambois. From this position, which they called the Mace, Polish artillery had direct observation of German columns trying to escape. The Poles called in fire continuously. Artillery shells rained down on the packed roads below. Between the shells, Typhoons dove and strafed. There was no respite, no moment of safety, no hope. German forces made desperate attempts to break through. 7 divisions threw themselves at the Polish positions. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted across the hilltop. The Poles held for 2 days, surrounded, running low on ammunition, calling in airstrikes on positions sometimes only yards away. The 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitler Jugend, those teenage fanatics who had held the line for weeks, finally broke. They had numbered 20,000 men and 150 tanks before Normandy. When they emerged from the pocket, only 300 men remained. 10 tanks, a 98% loss rate. An entire division annihilated. The numbers from Falaise are staggering. In 10 days of fighting, the German 7th Army ceased to exist as a military force. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died within the pocket. Another 50,000 were captured. Equipment losses included 350 tanks and assault guns, 500 trucks and transport vehicles, 250 artillery pieces. The 2nd Tactical Air Force alone flew over 12,000 sorties during the battle. Typhoon squadrons claimed destruction of hundreds of armored vehicles and thousands of transport vehicles. General Dwight Eisenhower visited the battlefield 2 days after the gap finally closed on August 21st. His description became famous. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. 48 hours after the closing of the gap, I was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. The narrow lanes around Chambois and Moissy were impossible to traverse. Burned-out vehicles lay bumper to bumper for miles. The corpses of horses and men were so thick they formed barriers. The stench was overwhelming. Flies blackened every surface. The August heat accelerated the decay. Destruction on this scale had rarely been seen in warfare. But here is what many people miss about Falaise. Not everyone died. Not everyone was captured. Perhaps 20,000 to 50,000 German troops made it through the gap before it fully closed. They left behind virtually all their heavy equipment, but they escaped. And these survivors would form the nucleus of new defensive positions as the Germans retreated toward their border. They would fight again at Arnhem. They would fight again in the Ardennes. The war was not over. Some historians have questioned the Typhoon's effectiveness at Falaise. Post-battle analysis showed that the actual hit rate for rockets was only about 4%. Out of every 100 rockets fired, only 4 struck their intended targets directly. Critics point to this as evidence that the Typhoon's reputation exceeded its actual effectiveness. They miss the point entirely. The rockets did not need direct hits to be effective. A 60-pound warhead exploding 10 yards from a truck was still lethal. The blast radius, the shrapnel, the secondary explosions from ammunition and fuel, all created devastation far beyond the point of impact, and the psychological effect was incalculable. German commanders stopped all daylight movement when typhoons were in the area. Supply convoys moved only at night, armor hid in forests and villages. The mere presence of typhoons overhead changed the tactical situation on the ground. The thunder had spoken, and an army had died. But the typhoons themselves paid a price. Flying low through curtains of flak took a constant toll. German 88 mm guns, 37mm automatic cannons. Even rifle fire could bring down a low-flying aircraft. During the Falaise battle alone, dozens of typhoons were hit by ground fire. Many made it back to base with shattered canopies, riddled fuselages, damaged engines. Others did not return at all. The pilots knew the risks. They flew anyway. Wing Commander Desmond Scott, who survived the war to write his memoir, described the losses in stark terms. Friends who flew out in the morning and never returned. Empty chairs in the mess hall. Personal belongings quietly packed away. Letters written to families who would never see their sons again. Yet they kept flying, mission after mission, day after day, because the ground forces depended on them, because the targets had to be destroyed, because someone had to do it. Paris fell on August 25th, 4 days after the Falaise Gap closed. By September, Allied forces were at the German border. The war that had seemed endless in June was now clearly in its final stages. But the thunder was not finished. In Part 3, we will follow the typhoons as they pushed into Germany itself. We will see what happened when the hunters became the hunted. When German jets appeared that could outrun anything with a propeller. When the war entered its final desperate months. And we will witness the last missions of these extraordinary aircraft and the men who flew them. The thunder had spoken at Falaise. But its final words were yet to come. In Part 1, we watched the Hawker Typhoon transform from a death trap into the most feared ground attack aircraft of World War II. In Part 2, we witnessed the slaughter at Falaise. 10,000 German soldiers dead, 50,000 captured, an entire army destroyed in 10 days. The thunder had spoken. But Falaise was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger. Something that would follow the retreating Wehrmacht all the way back to Berlin. After August 1944, German commanders issued new standing orders. No daylight movement when Allied aircraft were overhead. Convoys moved only at night. Armor hid in forests and villages. The mere sound of a Typhoon engine was enough to send entire units scrambling for cover. But hiding was not fighting, and the war was not over. The Typhoons followed the retreating Germans across France into Belgium toward the borders of the Reich itself. And what happened next would prove that Falaise was no accident. The thunder was just getting started. September 1944. The Allied advance had been spectacular. Paris liberated on August 25th. Brussels fell on September 3rd. Antwerp, with its massive port, was captured on September 4th. In barely 3 weeks, Allied forces had advanced over 300 miles. But now they faced a problem. Supply lines stretched to breaking point. Fuel was running short. Ammunition was rationed. The port of Antwerp, though captured, could not be used because German forces still held the Scheldt estuary. Everything had to come through the beaches of Normandy and the artificial Mulberry harbors. It was not enough. Field Marshal Montgomery proposed a solution. A bold stroke that would end the war by Christmas. Operation Market Garden. The plan was audacious. 3 airborne divisions would drop behind German lines in Holland. They would seize a series of bridges over the major rivers. Ground forces would race up a single road to link up with them. If successful Allied armor would cross the Rhine and sweep into Germany's industrial heartland. It was the largest airborne operation in history. 35,000 paratroopers and glider troops. Hundreds of transport aircraft. Thousands of fighter planes providing cover. And the Typhoons had a crucial role to play. September 17, 1944. The sky over Holland fills with aircraft. Transport planes carrying paratroopers. Gliders packed with troops and equipment. Fighter escorts weaving between them. On the ground, German forces watch in disbelief. No one had expected an attack of this magnitude. German commanders scramble to respond. But before they can organize, the Typhoons arrive. 83 Group, 2nd Tactical Air Force flew continuous missions that day. Their targets were German positions that threatened the drop zones. Flak batteries, troop concentrations, any vehicle that moved. Wing Commander Kit North Lewis led 124 Wing over the Arnhem area. Below him, British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division were landing. German 88mm batteries were already firing at the transport planes. North Lewis pushed his Typhoon into a dive. His target was a flak position on the outskirts of Arnhem. 4 guns surrounded by sandbags. Crews working frantically to reload. 8 rockets screamed from his wings. 6 missed. 2 hit the sandbag emplacement dead center. The position simply ceased to exist. Behind him, 3 more Typhoons were already diving. Within 60 seconds, the flak battery was silenced. But Market Garden was not Falaise. The Germans at Arnhem were different. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions refitting in the area after their mauling in France. Veterans, survivors, men who had seen Typhoons before and learned to fight back. They dispersed. They used buildings for cover. They moved in small groups through woods and gardens where aircraft could not see them. And they fought with desperate determination. The Typhoons flew mission after mission. They attacked German armor moving toward Arnhem. They struck troop concentrations. They hit supply convoys. But it was not enough. The British paratroopers at Arnhem were cut off. The ground advance stalled. The weather turned bad. For 3 crucial days, low clouds and rain grounded the typhoons. When the weather cleared on September 21st, it was too late. The bridge at Arnhem had been lost. The remnants of 1st Airborne Division were fighting for survival in a shrinking perimeter. The typhoons did what they could. They attacked German positions around the pocket. They dropped supplies to the trapped paratroopers. But Market Garden had failed. Of the 10,000 men who landed at Arnhem, only 2,400 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. It was a sobering lesson. Air power alone could not win battles. The typhoon was devastating against exposed targets. But against a determined enemy using cover and concealment, its effectiveness was limited. And then winter came. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Fog blankets the hills. Snow covers the ground. Visibility is measured in yards. At 5:30 a.m., German artillery opens fire along an 80-mile front. 200,000 German soldiers surge forward. Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, SS Panzer divisions. This is Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last gamble in the West. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. And the typhoons cannot fly. For the first 5 days of the German offensive, weather grounded almost all Allied aircraft. The fog was so thick that pilots could not see their own wingtips. The clouds sat on the treetops. Flying was suicide. German forces exploited the respite. Tanks rolled down forest roads unopposed. Infantry swept through American positions. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed. The Germans advanced 50 miles in the first week. It was the worst crisis the Western Allies had faced since D-Day. But on December 23rd, the weather changed. The fog lifted. The clouds broke apart. For the first time in a week, the sun appeared over the Ardennes. The typhoons were waiting. Within hours of the weather clearing, every available aircraft was in the air. 2nd Tactical Air Force threw everything it had at the German columns. Typhoons, Tempests, Spitfires, American P-47. Thunderbolts joined them. What followed was Falaise all over again. German columns caught in the open were massacred. The Typhoon pilots had learned their trade in Normandy. Now they applied those lessons with deadly efficiency. Flight Lieutenant Jack Collins of 182 Squadron was over the Ardennes on December 23rd. His target was a German armored column moving toward Bastogne. The column stretched for 2 miles. Tanks, half-tracks. Trucks loaded with infantry. They had been moving in daylight, confident that the weather would protect them. They were wrong. Collins led his flight of 4 Typhoons in from the east out of the morning sun. The Germans never saw them coming. First pass. Rockets. 32 projectiles slamming into the head of the column. The lead Tiger tank exploded as a rocket penetrated its engine deck. A half-track flipped onto its side. A truck burst into flames. The column stopped. Vehicles piled into each other. Men jumped from trucks and ran for the trees. Second pass. Cannons. 12 800 rounds per minute from 16 guns. The shells walked through the stalled column like a scythe through wheat. Trucks shattered. Men fell. Third pass. More rockets. More cannon fire. By now the column was a chaos of burning vehicles and running men. Collins made 6 passes before running out of ammunition. Then he flew back to base rearmed and returned to do it again. By nightfall, on December 23rd, German commanders knew their offensive was doomed. Without air superiority, they could not move in daylight. Without movement, they could not maintain momentum. Without momentum, the attack would fail. And it did fail. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. German forces were pushed back to their starting positions. They had lost over 100,000 men, 800 tanks and assault guns, thousands of vehicles. The Typhoons had not won the battle alone, but they had made victory possible. As 1945 began, the Typhoons moved forward into territory they had helped conquer. Airfields in Belgium and France that had been Luftwaffe bases now hosted RAF squadrons. The hunters had become permanent residents of the hunting ground. February 1945. The Typhoon squadrons receive new orders. Operation Clarion. For 48 hours, every available Allied aircraft would attack transportation targets across Germany. Rail yards, bridges, roads, anything that moved. The goal was to paralyze German logistics completely. On February 22nd, over 9,000 Allied aircraft participated in Clarion. Among them were 18 Typhoon squadrons. The targets were deep inside Germany now, cities the pilots had only heard about. Cologne, Dusseldorf, Essen, the industrial heart of the Reich. German anti-aircraft defenses were thicker than anything they had faced before. Flak towers, 88mm batteries, quadruple 20mm guns. The Germans had concentrated their remaining air defenses around vital targets. Flying through this was like flying into a wall of steel. Squadron leader Jimmy Kyle of 257 Squadron described a mission over the Ruhr on February 23rd. The flak was unbelievable. Everywhere you looked, black puffs, orange flashes, tracers rising from the ground like red streams. You could hear it hitting the aircraft. Pings and cracks, like flying through a hailstorm of death. We went after a rail yard near Essen. The target was packed with rolling stock, locomotives, freight cars, exactly what we had been briefed to hit. I pushed into my dive and fired my rockets. I saw them hit among the trains, secondary explosions, ammunition cars cooking off, then the cannons. I held the trigger until I passed through 1,000 feet. Something hit my tail. The aircraft bucked. I felt the controls go sloppy. But she kept flying. I pulled out over the rooftops. The flak followed me. I could see the gunners on the buildings tracking me with their weapons. My wingman was not so lucky. His Typhoon took a direct hit from an 88. The aircraft simply disintegrated. No parachute. Kyle made it back to base with 47 flak holes in his aircraft. The tail section was barely attached. Ground crews counted the holes and shook their heads. They could not believe he had survived. The losses during Clarion were heavy, but the results were devastating for Germany. Rail traffic in Western Germany dropped by 75% in the week following the operation. Factories that depended on coal could not get supplies. Troops could not be moved. Ammunition could not be distributed. The German war machine was grinding to a halt. March 1945. The Allies reached the Rhine. Operation Varsity. The last major airborne operation of the war. 2 airborne divisions would drop east of the Rhine to secure the bridgehead. The Typhoons flew continuous missions in support. They attacked German positions along the river. They struck artillery batteries that threatened the crossing points. They hunted any German vehicle that dared to move. On March 24th, Flying Officer Dennis Nolan of 193 Squadron was providing close support for the crossing. The Rhine stretched below us like a silver ribbon. We could see the boats, hundreds of them, carrying troops to the far shore. And we could see the German positions, machine gun nests, mortar pits, artillery positions dug into the slopes. We went after an 88mm battery that was shelling the crossing point. 4 guns in reinforced positions, sandbags and logs. They knew we were coming. They were firing at us as we dove. I released my rockets at 4,000 feet, watched them arc toward the guns. 3 explosions among the positions. 1 gun went silent immediately. Then the cannons. I walked my fire across the battery. Saw the shells tearing into the sandbags. The crew scattered. Some fell. When I pulled out, the battery was silent. The Rhine crossing succeeded. Within days, Allied forces were pouring into the heart of Germany. The Typhoons had helped make it possible. By April 1945, the war was clearly in its final days. German resistance was collapsing everywhere. But the Typhoons kept flying. There were still targets, still convoys to destroy, still positions to attack, and there were still losses. On April 25, 1945, Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Murphy of 266 Squadron took off on what should have been a routine armed reconnaissance mission over northern Germany. Murphy had survived D-Day. He had survived Falaise. He had survived the Bulge. He had flown over 150 missions. He was one of the most experienced Typhoon pilots in the RAF. He never returned. His aircraft was hit by flak near Bremen. It crashed into a field. Murphy was killed instantly. He was 23 years old. 2 weeks later, the war in Europe ended. The final Typhoon combat missions were flown on May 7, 1945, armed reconnaissance over northern Germany, looking for units that might not have received surrender orders. They found nothing. The guns were silent. The thunder had finally stopped. The statistics from the Typhoon's final months are remarkable. Between September 1944 and May 1945, 2nd Tactical Air Force flew over 150,000 sorties. They fired nearly 200,000 rockets. They claimed destruction of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, countless locomotives and rail cars. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The Typhoon had changed warfare. It had proven that aircraft could be decisive in ground combat. That air power properly applied could break armies. That the traditional distinction between fighter and bomber was becoming obsolete. Every modern ground attack aircraft owes something to the Typhoon. The A-10 Warthog, the Su-25, the Apache helicopter, all descended from the lessons learned over Normandy and the Ardennes. And the men who flew the Typhoons in Part 4, we will follow them home. We will see what happened to the aircraft that saved their lives and haunted their dreams. We will meet the veterans who carried their memories for decades. And we will discover why the Typhoon, perhaps the most effective ground attack aircraft of World War II, was almost completely forgotten. The thunder had spoken, but its echoes would last for generations. In Part 1, we watched a failed aircraft transform from a death trap into a weapon of unprecedented destruction. In Part 2, we witnessed the slaughter at Falaise, where 10,000 German soldiers died, and 50,000 more were captured in 10 days of unrelenting carnage. In Part 3, we followed the Typhoons from Arnhem to the Ardennes to the Rhine crossing, watching them help break the Wehrmacht across 3 nations. The thunder had spoken, and armies had fallen. But what happened after the guns went silent? What became of the men who flew these missions? What became of the aircraft that saved their lives and haunted their dreams? This is where our story takes an unexpected turn. Because the Hawker Typhoon, perhaps the most effective ground attack aircraft of World War II, would be almost completely erased from history. And the men who flew it would carry their memories in silence for decades. Success sometimes comes with a price no one expects to pay. Let me show you what I mean. Wing Commander Desmond Scott survived the war. He had flown over 200 missions. He had led squadrons over Normandy, Falaise, and into Germany itself. He had watched friends die. He had killed more men than he could count. When the war ended, Scott returned to New Zealand. He tried to resume normal life. But normal life seemed impossibly distant. How do you explain Falaise to your wife? How do you describe the smell of burning vehicles and burning men to your children? How do you sleep when the dreams come? Scott struggled with what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The memories never faded. Decades later, he could still hear the sound of his rockets striking German convoys. He could still see the fires. He could still smell the smoke. In 1982, at the age of 73, Scott finally wrote his memoir, Typhoon Pilot. It took him 37 years to find the words. The book was honest in ways that few war memoirs are. Scott did not glorify what they had done. He acknowledged the horror alongside the pride. He wrote about the necessity and the nightmares in equal measure. I have never forgotten those scenes. Gruesome ones of death and destruction, and I cannot forget them. They are etched into my brain. I can smell them now. Scott lived until 2008. He died at 92 years old, one of the last surviving Typhoon wing commanders. To the end, he rarely spoke about the war. The memories were too heavy to share casually. He was not alone. Squadron leader Roland Beaumont. The man who first recognized what the Typhoon could become had a different path. After the war, he became one of Britain's most famous test pilots. He flew the first British jet fighters. He set speed records. He helped develop aircraft that would serve for decades. But Beaumont never forgot his Typhoon days. In interviews late in life, he spoke about the aircraft with a mixture of pride and pain. Pride in what they had accomplished, pain at the cost. We did what we had to do. The ground forces depended on us. The war had to be won. But I never took pleasure in the killing. No decent man could. Beaumont died in 2001 at the age of 81. His obituaries focused on his test pilot career. The Typhoon years were mentioned only briefly, as if that chapter of his life was best left closed. The ordinary pilots. The men who flew mission after mission without ever becoming famous mostly vanished into civilian life. They became teachers, accountants, farmers, factory workers. They raised families. They built careers. They rarely spoke about the war. Some joined veteran organizations. They met once a year to remember fallen comrades. They drank toasts to the dead. Then they went home and said nothing. Their children often learned about their father's war service only after they died, going through old papers, finding medals in forgotten boxes, discovering photographs of young men standing beside massive aircraft with rockets under their wings. By then it was too late to ask questions, too late to hear the stories, too late to understand. The aircraft themselves fared even worse. When the war ended, the Royal Air Force had no need for thousands of piston-engine ground attack aircraft. The jet age was beginning. The Gloucester Meteor was already in service. The future belonged to turbines, not propellers. The Typhoons were declared surplus almost immediately. By late 1945, aircraft that had been built months earlier were being cut up for scrap metal. The aluminum was recycled. The engines were removed, most to be melted down. The guns were salvaged. Everything else was destroyed. Hundreds of Typhoons disappeared in a matter of months. Aircraft that had survived flak over Normandy, that had dove on German columns at Falaise, that had hunted tanks in the Ardennes, were reduced to piles of scrap metal and shipped to foundries. Nobody thought to preserve them. Nobody imagined that someday people would want to remember. By 1946, there were almost no complete Typhoons left anywhere in the world. Today, only a handful survive. The Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon has one. The Canada Aviation and Space Museum has partial wreckage recovered from a crash site. A few other pieces exist in private collections. That is all that remains of 3 317 aircraft built. Less than a dozen survive in any form. But the legacy of the Typhoon lives on in ways most people never realize. Every modern ground attack aircraft owes something to the lessons learned over Normandy. The tactics developed by Typhoon pilots in 1944 became the foundation for close air support doctrine that militaries still use today. The concept of the fighter bomber, an aircraft that could both protect itself and deliver devastating ground attacks, came directly from Typhoon experience. Before the Typhoon fighters were fighters and bombers were bombers. The Typhoon proved that the distinction was artificial. One aircraft could do both jobs. The American A-10 Thunderbolt II. The famous Warthog that served in every American conflict from the Gulf War to Afghanistan was designed with Typhoon lessons in mind. Heavy armor to protect the pilot, massive firepower for ground attack, the ability to absorb damage and keep flying. These concepts came directly from World War II experience. The Soviet Union developed the Su-25 Frogfoot using similar principles. Heavy, armored, devastating against ground targets. The lineage traces back to Normandy. Attack helicopters like the Apache and Cobra inherited Typhoon tactics. Low-level approach, dive to attack, fire rockets and guns, pull away. The profile is essentially unchanged from what Desmond Scott flew over Falaise. The numbers from Typhoon operations became textbook examples taught at military academies around the world. How to calculate ammunition requirements, how to coordinate air support with ground forces, how to assess damage and adjust tactics. Staff officers at West Point and Sandhurst still study Falaise. They analyze what worked, they examine what failed, they extract lessons that remain relevant 80 years later. The rocket projectiles that Typhoons fired evolved into the modern air-to-ground missile. From RP-3 to Hellfire, the basic concept remained the same. A guided or unguided projectile launched from an aircraft capable of destroying vehicles and fortifications. The Typhoon proved the concept. Modern technology refined it. In total, Typhoon operations helped establish principles that have saved countless lives in conflicts around the world. Every soldier who has called for close air support and received it owes something to the men who figured out how to do it over the hedgerows of Normandy. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Typhoon story is not about technology at all. It is about transformation, about second chances, about the possibility that something written off as a failure can become essential. The Typhoon was designed to be something it could never be, a high-altitude interceptor. It failed at that mission catastrophically. It killed its own pilots. It nearly ended careers. It almost destroyed Hawker Aircraft's reputation. Yet from that failure came something unexpected. Someone looked at the wreckage of expectations and saw possibility instead of defeat. Someone asked not what the Typhoon could not do, but what it could do. Someone had the courage to suggest that maybe, just maybe, everyone had been asking the wrong questions. That kind of thinking changes wars. It changes industries. It changes the world. How many other innovations have been abandoned because they failed at their original purpose? How many potentially revolutionary ideas have been discarded because they did not meet specifications that were themselves flawed? The Typhoon teaches us to look twice, to question assumptions, to see failure as information rather than verdict. Every military has institutional resistance to new ideas. Every large organization protects established ways of doing things. The people who suggested the Typhoon should be canceled were not stupid. They were applying reasonable logic to available evidence. The aircraft was dangerous. Pilots were dying. Resources were limited. But they were wrong. Being wrong with good intentions and solid reasoning is still being wrong. The Typhoon story reminds us that expertise can be a trap, that experience can blind us to possibility, that sometimes the radical idea is the correct one. And there is one final detail that most people never hear. The Typhoon nearly disappeared from history entirely. After the war, official histories focused on the Spitfire. That aircraft became the symbol of British air power. Movies were made about it. Books were written. Museums built exhibits around it. The Spitfire was beautiful, elegant, the fighter that won the Battle of Britain. The Typhoon was ugly, brutish, a killer rather than a defender. It did not fit the narrative that post-war Britain wanted to tell about itself. So the Typhoon was quietly forgotten. For decades, you could read comprehensive histories of World War II without finding more than a paragraph about the Typhoon. The aircraft that helped destroy the German army in the West was reduced to a footnote. Only in recent decades has this changed. New research, declassified documents, veteran memoirs finally published. The Typhoon story began to emerge from the shadows. We now know things that were hidden for 50 years. We have German records that confirm what Typhoon pilots claimed. We have casualty figures that validate the destruction at Falaise. We have testimony from both sides that proves the Typhoon's devastating effectiveness. The aircraft that was almost canceled, almost forgotten, is finally being recognized for what it was. One of the most important weapons of the war. In 2018, researchers located the crash site of a Typhoon in France. The aircraft had been shot down in August 1944. The pilot had been killed. For 74 years, it lay in a field, slowly sinking into the earth. They recovered what they could. Engine parts, pieces of fuselage, the 4 cannons still loaded with ammunition, fragments of the instrument panel. The pilot was identified. His name was added to a memorial. His family, who had never known exactly where or how he died, finally had closure. 74 years. That is how long it took for one young man's sacrifice to be fully acknowledged. There are hundreds more out there. Crash sites never investigated. Pilots never found. Stories never told. The thunder has been silent for 80 years, but its echoes are still being discovered. So what do we take from this story? From a failed interceptor that killed its own pilots to the most feared ground attack aircraft of World War II. From near cancellation in 1942 to the destruction of an entire German army in 1944. From obscurity and scrap metal to recognition and remembrance. The Hawker Typhoon flew over 200,000 sorties. It fired nearly 200,000 rockets. It helped liberate France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It helped end the war in Europe. The men who flew it were mostly in their early 20s. Many were teenagers. They faced flak every mission. They lost friends every week. They kept flying anyway. They did not ask for glory. Most received none. They asked only that their sacrifice meant something. That the war would end. That their children would live in peace. It did mean something. The war did end. And we are their children. If you know another story of wartime innovation, of an idea that was called crazy until it changed everything, share it in the comments below. History is full of these moments, full of ordinary people who refused to accept that something could not be done. The Typhoon story is just one of hundreds, but it reminds us of something essential. Sometimes the failed idea is actually the right idea, waiting for someone brave enough to see it differently. Sometimes thunder begins as a whisper that everyone ignores. And sometimes the weapons that seem like disasters become the ones that win wars. That is the lesson of the Hawker Typhoon. From failure to legend, from death trap to liberator, from forgotten to remembered. The thunder spoke, and we are still listening.